Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Carrie, and today I am doing my March wrap-up. I am super late. As always, I'm known to procrastinate, and this is just another example of that. So in the month of March, I read, I believe, 17 books, so we've got a lot to talk about. Now, if you've been watching some of my vlogs, especially the Kindle Clear Out reading vlog, then you may see some of these as repeats or books that I've already talked about, so I apologize in advance. But for those of you who don't watch my vlogs, hopefully this will give you an idea of books that I've been reading recently. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about these in the order of which I read them. The first book that I read in the month of March is Look the Part. This is by Jewel E. Ann, and I gave this book 4.5 stars. It is a nanny single father romance, which is kind of something that I'm obsessed with lately. So this book is about Flint and Ellen. Flint is a single father. He has an autistic son, so there is representation for autistic children, which I thought was very realistic. And Ellen is a musical therapy coach, musical therapist, whatever. And she is moving into his building. He has rented out his building, part of his building, to her. He doesn't realize what a musical therapist is and that there's actually real music involved with music therapy. And so a couple of days after he gives her the keys, he basically says, "This isn't working, you need to move out." But his son, who is autistic, really likes her and has taken a liking to the whole musical therapy. He goes up and she is helping him with the guitar and they are talking, and so he's having a hard time kicking her out, but he really needs to because he's a lawyer and it's very distracting having this music going on and he can hear it constantly. So they have this little bit of a hate to love back and forth relationship. Something that I thought was kind of crazy was that I actually attempted to read this last year in March of 2020, and I was listening to the audiobook while I was reading it, and I hated the audiobook so much that I DNF'd it at like 15 or 20% in, and I was done. I was not having it. I couldn't stand the book. So I really actually thought I hated this book. Turns out I just hated the narrator of this book. She made the book awful for me. So I kept hearing all these other people on BookTube talking about this book and how much they loved it. And I'm like, really? Because I hated it. And so I'm like, well, you know what? Maybe I should give it a try, but read it in a different format. And I'm so glad I did because I gave this 4.5 stars. I really, truly loved it. If you're into a grumpy hero and a nanny kind of situation, there is a surprise pregnancy trope in this. So warning for that. Also, there is a warning for a loss of a loved one due to drunk driving. So there is a little bit of trigger warnings in here for those. But overall, I really, really enjoyed this book. I don't mind a good surprise pregnancy trope. I actually really like that trope. I know I'm not like the average person on that. Majority of people don't like it. I personally love it. So I wasn't bothered by that at all. But if you are, you may want to skip this one. I really enjoyed it overall. The next book on my list is Play. This is book number 2 in the Stage Dive series by Kylie Scott. I really enjoyed this one. I am a sucker for a good rock star trope, and this had it in spades. This is the drummer, as you can obviously tell here, but this is about Mal and Anne. Mal is acting very bizarre. He is acting almost manic, and his bandmates are very worried about him. He's acting out a lot worse than even normal. He's not acting like himself. He's actually acting very mentally ill, and all of his bandmates are worried about him. He ends up meeting Anne at the beginning of this book. It's kind of like a poor girl meets rock star fake dating kind of trope. He ends up moving into her house without her permission, and they start this fake dating relationship. She ends up learning some major issues with Mal and what he's going through and what he's trying to hide, and his behavior and who he is starting to make some sense. He does have, I believe, some mental illness in this, so there is some manic behavior for sure, but it's actually really, really good read. and I loved how Anne was very helpful and very sweet to Mal, especially whenever he got into the worst part of his manic behavior. So I really enjoyed this. I listened to this one on audiobook, and I actually highly recommend the audiobook for this. In fact, for the whole series. I'm a big fan of the audiobook for this. The next book that I read was Layla by Colleen Hoover, and this is a book unlike anything I've ever read before. Colleen is really good about that. She gives me books that are just so out there, but like something that I didn't know I needed in my life. So this is kind of a ghost story. I don't really, paranormal ghost relationship. It's about Layla and Leeds, also Sadie and Willow. Sadie? Yeah. This is a book that's very, very hard to talk about without giving major spoilers away, and I don't think anybody needs to know the spoilers for this book. If you're going to read it, I think you should go in blind. I really enjoyed the book. It did start out a little slow for me. The middle was kind of slow as well. There was parts of it, whenever it picked up and I started to understand what was going on, it was like, holy crap, no way. There are some trigger warnings for the thought of cheating in this book, but it's not really cheating. I don't know. I don't want to give anything away. Like, I really just, it's hard to give away spoilers. It's hard to give away any kind of warnings or anything for this book. If this book at all intrigues you, if you've heard about it and people talking about it, if you are a fan of Colleen Hoover, I say give it a shot. Go in, give it a minute, because it does start out a little slow. You're not really understanding what's happening, and it's very confusing at first. It does kind of start slow, but it builds up, and it's really good, and it's a very unique love story. I really enjoyed it. I gave it, I think, 4 stars. The next book that I read is Playboy Pilot by Vi Keelan and Penelope Ward. I am trying to read a book a month by this author, and I enjoyed this one once again. I believe I gave this one 4 stars. Yes, I did. I gave this one 4 stars as well. This is a great vacation summer read. And this is one that I would highly, highly, highly recommend listening to it on audiobook. It has 2 of my favorite audiobook narrators who narrate this book. I got to listen to it at 3 times the speed, and their voices are just very great. They're just great. And so I would highly recommend listening to this one on audio if you do that. But it's a great summertime vacation type of read. He is a pilot. They meet at the airport, and they go on this crazy vacation. It's insta love done right. So these people meet at the airport. They have this instant connection. He asks her basically to go on his flight. No, she doesn't realize he's a pilot. And so she goes on the plane, and he's not there. She gets off, and something happens while on the flight that makes her realize that he's a pilot. And they end up spending a couple of weeks together, and these weeks are magical. And she's going through this major decision in her life, and he is kind of through with his Playboy ways, but he's been known as a womanizer. And it's their relationship, and it's just very sweet, very little angst. I would highly recommend listening to this in between like heavier stuff. And it's just, like I said, it's just a great vacation type of read. The next book that I have to talk about is Don't Kiss the Bride. This is by Karen Cole. I'm not sure how you pronounce her name. This was my least favorite by her. I'm not rating this book because it just wasn't for me. But lots of people love it, and there are tons of booktubers who really love this book. It put me in a bit of a reading slump. It was extremely slow paced. So couple of tropes for this is that there is an age gap. It is a marriage of convenience. There is a major trigger warning for an eating disorder for this book. So these are all typical things that I absolutely adore in books. It just didn't work for me because normally age gap, where it's a kind of like a marriage of convenience or a like a slow burn type of romance like this, I typically want there to be a lot of sexual tension between the 2 main characters, and I didn't really feel that. I felt like our hero really, because he was in his 30s and she was 18, he thought she was just a kid. And so he married her, but he almost treated her in a way like his kid sister. He was very much so hands off, like don't mess with her. And they had this really great friendship, but it very much so, in my opinion, felt very platonic. It did not feel like couldn't keep their eyes off each other, you know, like that sexual tension that typically happens. It just felt like two friends through a majority of this book. Not to mention, our heroine is fighting a major eating disorder, and it's very heartbreaking and very, very sad. It's realistically done, and it was good, but it just was heartbreaking to read about. It wasn't a very sexy book, in my opinion. Even when they got together, I still felt like they were more friends than they were lovers. And there's something that just didn't connect with me on this one. So I read several novellas for this month, and the next book I have to talk about is definitely a novella. This is when I got my reveal book box, and I was not happy about getting these little itty bitty tiny things, but I wanted to read them to get them out of my way. So we will go ahead and start with Forevermore. This is by Alex Grayson, and this was about Lincoln and Molly. So this is a friends to lovers, like epic romance, epic love. It starts out when they are 8 years old. Yes, it starts out as an 8-year-old, and it goes until they're 28. And it's the span of this entire time. They start out as best friends at the age of 8, and they grow up and they become more than best friends by the time they're, you know, in their teenage years. And then they get married young, and they start their own little life together. And it does end in a really kind of sad cliffhanger where she is pregnant and something happens. And it's just really heartbreaking. I've heard that this is a novella, like a prequel to a regular novel. And the novel, I've read some reviews on it, and everybody's talking about how good it is, but how heartbreaking it is. And I know where the book is going, and I don't want to read it. No offense to the author, this was beautifully written. It was sweet. I gave it 3.5 stars. It was a little boring in places. It's a kind of a friends to lovers thing. It's very, very short. But the first book sounds beyond heartbreaking, and it's just not something that I want to cry over. So I have chosen not to read the first book in the series. The next book I picked up was also the other little tiny novella I got in my reveal book box. This is Mail Order Brit by Poppy Parks. And this one I gave 2.5 stars to. So this is a mail order bride, nanny, and insta love. Insta love. So what did I say about this? It's been a while since I've read this one. The writing for the most part wasn't bad. I did enjoy the story overall. There was some major issues that I have. First of all, obviously the insta love. Wasn't a fan of that. Also, it had cringy sex scenes in this one. Like really cringy sex scenes, including words. I've got to read these because these are doozies. So, including words such as golden thatch, folds dripping, lines his cock up with my cave, and more. So, 2.5 stars goes to that one. Okay, so now we are getting into books that I started to read for my Kindle Clear Out Readathon. So I'm going to try not to go into major spoilers or major details on these books because I've already talked about them in more detail on my Kindle Clear Out Readathon vlog. I will link that down below. But I will go ahead and go over a small portion of them, overall thoughts, whatever. The first one that I have to talk about is That Night with My Best Friend's Brother. This is by J.S. Cooper. I gave this 2 stars. I think that this author just isn't for me. I've read 2 books of hers now. The first book I gave 1 star. The second book I gave 2 stars. And this is your girl who's a petty bitch. And so I kind of want to read the next book in this series, even though I gave it 2 stars. How ridiculous is that? So this one, it's about a girl who obviously has a night with her best friend's brother, but it's whenever she is like 16, I think, and he's like 19 or 20. This book is short. I enjoyed the forbidden, like, back and forth, the make you jealous kind of trope. Like I said, I'm a petty bitch, so I like that kind of thing. The issue that I had with this book was that it was badly written. The author made these 20-something-year-old women sound like they were 13-year-old girls. I don't really know. I don't know what to say about this book. I gave it 2 stars. The next book that I have to talk about is To Have. This is by Alessandra Torrey. I gave this one 5 stars. We're going to talk about this in a lot more detail coming up whenever I read the full book. But this little first portion of the book, I gave it 5 stars. It's about a stripper who is working the poles, and this guy comes in and basically buys her. They have this fake dating relationship where he kind of treats her like trash. He takes her home and has her sign a contract. They end up getting married. I'll go into more details about this later. This first initial part of it, this little tiny novella, which was only like 1/4 of the book, I gave it 5 stars. It goes downhill from there. The next book that I read for the Kindle Clear Out Readathon is Tough Love. This is by Skye Warren. This is a mafia romance. It is about 2 teenagers who are falling in love. One of them is the daughter of the mafia boss, like head honcho guy, and the guy is one of the working guy's sons. And so it's super forbidden, super taboo. The older sister of the girl who's in this is in a relationship with this really nasty guy who's very abusive to her, and they end up having to run away. They have to get away from there because she is being physically abused and her father is just not stopping it. And it was beautifully written, 5 stars. I cannot wait to read more from Skye Warren. I loved her writing, adored this book. The next book I read for the Kindle Clear Out Readathon was Storm. This is by Nina Levine. I gave this book 2.5 stars. It is an MC romance. MC romances, I think, are just not for me. Either that or I've just been really reading the wrong types of MC romances. They are a bit immature. This one is about Jason and Madison. So it's a pretty short book, was my pro, and my con was like the overuse of the word babe. That annoys the shit out of me in these MC romance books, where it's like babe this, babe that, babe this, babe that. Like, I hated Lessons in Corruption by Gianna Darling for that very reason, was because he used the term babe 15 times on every page, it felt like. Like, seriously, no joke. It was on at least 2 to 3 times on every single page. I don't know how anybody gave that book 4 and 5 stars. I don't understand it. It annoyed the shit out of me. But yeah, so similar thing happened here. I gave it 2.5 stars. The immaturity of the characters just wasn't for me. The next book was Bite Me. This is by CC Wood. This was a vampire romance, and it was very cheesy. I gave it 3 stars. It's about Connor and Donna, and Donna is working as a bartender or a waitress, and Connor comes in, and of course he protects her, kind of similar to True Blood vibes on that part, where she is in danger and he ends up saving her life. But anyway, he is a vampire, and yeah, it's just like, she doesn't believe he's a vampire. There's no way he could be a vampire. He's nuts. He's psychotic. And then all of a sudden she believes it, and then he has some psycho girlfriend who is a vampire who's coming after her. It's very, very cheesy. Very, very cheesy. And the next book that I read for the Kindle Clear Out Readathon was The Awakening of Ivy Leopold. I gave this book 5 stars. It's by Sierra Simone, and I've talked about this on so much detail that all I'm going to say is that it is a historical romance. It is about a girl whose brother has recently died, and now she's having to go and live with this guy who is married to her cousin. Her cousin has just passed away, and so she thinks she's moving in with this possibly old dude. She doesn't really know. And she gets there, and he's gorgeous, and they have this connection. He is a dominant. It is a BDSM type relationship. He also has a group of swinger type of friends who, you know, their lifestyle is all to get together and just have some fun. And it's historical romance, but it's out there, and it's so good. It's so good. The next book that I read is Trophy Wife. This is by Alessandra Torrey. So where I started out with To Have, and I adored it so much, I gave it 5 stars, could not wait to continue on with the series. I continued on with the series, and Trophy Wife was terrible. This is about Nathan and Candy. So this is a girl who is a stripper. She has this fake relationship. She's now moved in with this guy who is like Cinderella her, you know, where she gets this house and all this stuff. There's cheating involved in this, where she is messing around with one of his right-hand mans, and there is rape in this book, like straight up. Like that's her husband. They are having an active sexual relationship, and he forces her. He is paying for her father for his care in a home facility thing while he is getting the help he needs. He's very sick, and so he's paying for that. And he forces her to perform oral sex on another person, and is basically like, well, if you want me to keep paying for your father, you'll do this. So it's straight up rape. Yeah, I hated it. 2 stars. Was not for me at all. Like, cannot stand that book. The next book that I read was The Education of Ivy Leopold. I'm not going into major spoilers for this book. I will say that it is about a main guy and a main girl, so they do have some fun with other couples and stuff, but it is about one specific couple. They do eventually get married. They have this whole relationship. There's also a murder mystery plot line. I didn't mention that before, but there is a murder mystery plot line involving her cousin, and she thinks that her, this guy that her cousin was with could have possibly killed her, and then she realizes that it's probably not him who did it, but then there was this whodunit aspect. It's a really good series. It's a trilogy. And then the next book I read was The Punishment of Ivy Leopold, which is to finish up the entire trilogy, and I gave this one 4 stars as well. By this book and the 3rd book, you finally realize who the killer is of her cousin, and then it all kind of comes to a head. They do get married in this book. It's a very, very sweet love story as well. And it's very hot, very, very hot and spicy romance. The next book that I read was Then She Was Gone. This is by Lisa Jewell. This was my first psychological thriller where there wasn't really much of a romance involved in this at all. I really enjoyed it. It is about a woman whose daughter goes missing. The daughter is 15 years old. They have this perfect life. She's the mother of 3 kids, and her youngest just disappears one day. She's going to the library to study, and nobody hears from her. And it's now 10 years later. The mother has kind of shut down, and they finally find the body of this little girl. The police in her hometown, this is all based in London, or in England anyway, and the police believed for the longest time that she just ran away, and they find her body, and they now realize that this is an active investigation. They don't really know what happened to her, but the details get really, really sad. Anyway, it's 10 years later. She has her funeral, and the mother kind of starts to feel like she can move on. She still has 2 children left. Her whole relationship has just kind of been, everybody kind of goes their own ways. And, you know, she gets divorced from her husband at the time. During all of this thing with her daughter missing, and her whole life is just kind of put to a halt. And she just wants to find out what happened to her daughter. Well, anyway, it's 10 years later. She has finally been able to move on a tiny bit after the funeral, and she starts dating this guy that she meets at a coffee shop. And they have this awesome relationship, and eventually she meets his daughter and finds out that his daughter is 9 years old. She's as cute as she can be, but she looks just like her daughter, like just like her. And eventually she starts putting pieces together. There wasn't a lot of twists and turns for it being a thriller. I was expecting more of like plot twist, and there wasn't really. It kind of just went along like exactly how I was expecting it to go. There was a couple little minor twists, but nothing like super radical. I still really enjoyed this book. I loved the whole idea of this woman dating this guy and her daughter looks just like the daughter that she, it's like this whole what the hell kind of moment. So anyway, I really did enjoy this one and I gave it 4 stars. That was all of the books that I read in March. Let me know what you've been reading lately. Is there anything that I just absolutely have to read? We'll talk in the comments below.